Fondation Jean-Jaurès.
Penser pour agir.
The war in Ukraine continues to affect the Western Balkans, a region in Europe. But one thing has hardly moved: the geopolitical course set by Alexander Vučić in Serbia. Serbia remains on the paper engaged on the path towards EU accession, but in the past few years, its commitment to consolidating democracy has vanished into thin air. And its ties also to Russia under Alexander Vučic's rule have not been challenged. To understand this paradox and also the movements which are now unfolding in Serbia, its implications, I received today Maja Bjelos. Maja, you are a senior researcher at the Belgrade Centre for Security Policy. I am Florent Marciacq, director of the Observatory des Balkans at Fondation Jean-Jaurès. Maja, hi.
Hi, hello.
Hi, in the past couple of weeks, we have seen large protest movements mushrooming in Serbia. Their scale is quite unprecedented. Can you tell us a little bit what these mass demonstrations or protests are about and how we should understand them?
So the protests that are taking place in Serbia, in many towns so far, for a month and a half, should be understood as a request by the citizens of Serbia for a political change, and request to live in a more democratic society without violence, state repression, and propaganda, but also to belong to a more economically developed part of the world. The two mass shootings were only the tip of the iceberg, but also a turning point, because the growing dissatisfaction with the ruling regime and their policies has exploded like a balloon, and people can no longer remain silent and tolerate the situation. What is more concerning is the ruthless behavior of the top Serbian leadership in response to these two mass shootings, and that behavior only fueled the existing grievances and anger. So with every new day, people have additional reason to go to the streets. The protesters demanded the resignation of two ministers, but also the members of regulatory media body, as well as withdrawal of broadcast license for two television channels, that is TV Pink and Happy, as well as a ban on some tabloids that promote violence, hate speech, and spread propaganda. However, these are the main tools or assets of the ruling elite. It's very hard for them to actually give up and fulfill demands. However, people on the streets are chanting Vučić out. So it's not only about these mass shootings, because the violence didn't stop, but it continued. And because of these chantings and because of the direct message of the protesters, the president of Serbia takes the protests personally. The government is not ready to fulfill demands because they see it as a defeat. They see the protests as a struggle for power. And Prime Minister Brnabić recently stated that if the opposition takes power, we will all end up in a prison. That statement is telling, because the ruling elite is somehow aware of their wrongdoings.
Mm-hmm. Tell me, Maja, these pro-democracy protests, how do they correlate or how do they relate with the geopolitical context? Serbia is one of the very, very few countries in Europe, with Belarus, which has refused to align itself with Western sanctions against Russia. And we know the links of the regime in Belgrade with Moscow. You have published with colleagues last December a report on Serbian public perceptions of foreign policy in the midst of the war in Ukraine. You have pointed out that the war in Ukraine did not significantly affect the perceptions of the Serbian citizens towards their government. That was in December. The pro-democratic protests now, do you see a connection also with a critical stance against the regime's foreign policy burgeoning, or is it a completely different track?
Well, the protest itself currently does not address foreign policy issues, such as war in Ukraine and Russia. However, they call for more democracy and more, in a way, genuine pro-Western orientation of the country. However, what is also perhaps linked, because people have realized that Vučić, in order to divert public's attention from the protest, people have realized that the leadership wants to export this internal crisis to Kosovo and create a new crisis. So there is a link more with Kosovo than what is happening in Ukraine, because as we confirmed in the last year, the public perception didn't change significantly on the war on the Ukraine, and they didn't believe that there will be some kind of spillover effects in the region.
And precisely because you mentioned Kosovo and the outburst of tensions in Kosovo. Now, how is it used by the government? So this crisis in northern Kosovo. And also this securitization of politics. Is it something which benefits the government? And how do you assess also the role of the EU and the shift of support? Now we have the US supporting more actively, very actively, Vučić. We have also support from other EU capitals. How does it play for the government?
Unfortunately, the Kosovo is very often instrumentalized in the domestic public. It was also instrumentalized, for example, last year when we had the Euro Pride in Belgrade, which was internal manifestation. And then the leadership used that argument. Let's not discuss the rule of law and human rights in the eves of very big protests and crisis in Kosovo over the registration car license plates. So this is also an attempt at the moment. So this situation in Kosovo is evidently escalating day by day. And leadership wants to impose Kosovo as a topic in the society, while the people just provide pushback. They somehow send the message that Kosovo is, although important, but it's no longer a topic of our society. So people are concerned about rule of law. They are concerned about growing violence, about massive human rights abuses, about economy, privatization, and so on. There are so many topics. Inflation, for example, inflation in Serbia is skyrocketing, but the government didn't address it for more than 2 years, nor provided the explanation. So citizens demand questions and demand accountability for all of these issues, but also including the Kosovo. However, with the crisis of Kosovo, somehow people fear that all of these topics will be just overshadowed and not properly addressed. And then many object. There is a lot of criticism towards the EU, but also the US, not only because of their role in the dialogue, because many people believe in Serbia, but I see in the region, Kosovo and elsewhere, that the US is appeasing somehow Vučić, and they support Vučić. So there is also call from protesters that EU and US, like the two very powerful players in the country, but also in the region, stop supporting stabilocrats and autocrats, and that they start supporting pro-democratic and genuinely pro-European forces, because there are a lot of pro-democratic and genuinely pro-Western forces in the country, but somehow people have impression that the EU, but also the EU member states as well as the US, do not support these forces.
I think you point very much to one of the shortcomings, at least also from the side of the EU in its accession policy. It is an intergovernmental process. It's focusing on cooperation with the regimes or with the authorities, and it neglects a little bit the opposition forces in countries where the regime is autocratic, and that is very much missing, as you say. I would like to ask you about precisely this revamping of the accession policy, making it work better. We've seen now with the changing geographies of enlargements that there is a need for once again revising the accession process. There are some ideas on the table regarding reversibility, for instance, and trying to engage also more with the civil societies. How can the EU do better what it has not done so well so far in promoting, supporting civil society, pro-European, democratic one, pro-democracy and progressive one? How can it make it better this time?
Well, I think that for tango needs two. So we are seeing so many attempts of the EU to change the methodology, then to change the process itself, then to introduce, maybe there were some ideas to introduce even junior membership for certain criteria and so on. But we need to tackle much, for example, bigger issues. One of the things is that, first of all, the Serbian political leaderships must sincerely want to join the EU. Not only officially and declaratively, but really walk the talk in a very short, to in practice show that it's really implementing reforms, which we are not seeing at the moment, because the whole country is captured by one ruling elite. And my opinion is that accession policy will come to life once Serbia gets a democratic and true pro-Western government. That is the one part of the tango. But the other part of the tango is the EU side. It's not. It's no longer only sufficient that EU has a new methodology and approach. It's very much important, for the EU accession process, is so far we have seen that EU accession process has been hijacked by bilateral disputes between the EU and non-EU countries. And in my opinion, EU needs internal reform to prevent a repeat of the Macedonian scenario. In case of, not only in case of Serbia, but in case of Kosovo, in Montenegro, North Macedonia, and so on, Albania, and so on. It's quite important that EU also conducts these kind of reforms. What is also important, because at the end, although the EU accession process is elite process, because it's done between the elites, the EU and Serbian elite. But at the end, it affects people. And and at the end, it's important, like in Croatia had a referendum before it joined the EU on the EU accession. So if EU wants support, it has to also do an effort within the EU. I believe that people became disappointed that currently, because of the war, the EU prioritized Ukraine over Western Balkans. That was the dominant feeling. And people have a feeling that EU member states didn't explain to their citizens why is important to include Western Balkan countries. So there is like a homework to be done also within the EU to explain and have much better like information or campaign on why it is also necessary, and then to build really genuine support within the EU, because people's support for the EU matters a lot. When it comes to the Serbia, what is quite important and cannot be neglected, because direct message from the EU is that all roads to the EU leads through Kosovo, meaning that without resolution with Kosovo, Serbia, but also the Kosovo cannot be accepted as a member. So we can come back again on a Kosovo issue dialogue in this bit. And the EU has many failures. In my opinion, from the day one, the more democratization of both societies and rule of law. Somehow, the EU prioritizes work with strong men and normalization of their relation and dialogue between the strong men, not the wider dialogue between two societies, not even internal dialogues, for example, between Albanians and Serbs in the Kosovo. So many things were like not done at the first place, and there were no strong monitoring mechanisms from the day one. So currently, in the current situation, we moved from the dialogue because the dialogue is not existent. Yeah. But not even today, but for so many years. I just want to point one out, because currently the main middleman is KFOR and not the EU. So we are back, both countries are back in the crisis management regime and not in the integration context. And we are supposed to be within the integration context. Serbia integration within the EU, Kosovo integration with different organizations, and we are not there. We are far away from that stage. And currently, when we zoom out and when we see a bigger picture, Serbia accepted to withdraw from Kosovo, and all agreements signed are the one step in that direction. However, we no longer speak about this. We don't speak about Serbia's recognition of Kosovo. We don't speak about Kosovo's responsibility to establish association, but we speak about that incident that happened, for example, release of Kosovo police officers and so on. So we are far away from what the goal is.
This crisis management mode you're pointing out, and the risk of prioritizing just stability on the short term and forgetting about the bigger picture. Thanks, Maja. You point things which are very important beyond just like the accession process. These are the bilateral disputes, and how should we approach them or not approach them, because they are disruptive. So this is one thing, and the other thing very important is how to build support not only so in the Western Balkans with civil society forces which want actually a progressive Europe, and not only the regimes in power, but also building support within the EU with its citizens. So there's also another dimension which is also overlooked. Thank you, Maja. Thanks a lot.
It was a pleasure speaking to you. Bye.
Goodbye.